A homeless veteran is mocked for inheriting a military scrapyard, 40 acres of rust, rot, and ridicule. Locals laugh. A corporate developer moves in like a vulture, offering pennies for what looks like worthless junk. But buried under broken choppers and twisted metal lies a secret worth $140 million, and a history the government tried to erase. As threats close in and sabotage turns deadly, one man stands between forgotten relics, and a war no one saw coming. Why would someone kill for a pile of old helicopters? And what did his grandfather hide, so powerful it could change everything? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty Texas landscape as Dalton Pierce pulled his weathered pickup truck onto the gravel road. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The certified letter from the lawyer's office crumpled in the passenger seat beside him. After 3 hours of driving, the GPS indicated he was finally approaching his destination. "You have arrived at your destination," the robotic voice announced, but Dalton could hardly believe his eyes. Before him stretched 40 acres of what appeared to be nothing but military wreckage, surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. He parked his truck and stepped out, his worn boots crunching on the gravel. The fence gate bore a faded sign reading, "Property of Colonel Marcus Pierce, no trespassing." Dalton's throat tightened at the sight of his grandfather's name. They hadn't spoken in 15 years, not since that bitter Christmas argument when Dalton was 20 years old. "So much for reconciliation," he muttered, fishing out the key the lawyer had provided. The lock was stiff but eventually yielded with a screech of protest. As Dalton pushed open the heavy gate, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. 3 pickup trucks pulled up behind his, and several locals stepped out, their curious faces a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Well, look who finally showed up to claim old Colonel Pierce's junkyard," called out a heavy-set man in overalls. "Heard you were living in your truck, boy, planning to make this heap your new home?" Dalton ignored the taunt and walked further into the property. What he saw made his heart sink lower with each step. 7 massive Apache helicopters, their once proud frames now reduced to rusted hulks, dominated the landscape. Their rotors drooped like defeated warriors, and their olive-drab paint had long since given way to orange-brown corrosion. "Those birds haven't flown in 30 years, another local shouted. "Your grandpa was crazy, keeping all this worthless junk. What's a homeless vet gonna do with it anyway?" The words stung, but Dalton kept walking, his military training helping him maintain his composure. Mountains of corroded equipment surrounded him. Old radar units, communication gear, and countless mysterious components he couldn't identify. Everything bore the harsh marks of decades of exposure to the elements. A woman's voice carried across the yard. "I tried to buy this land from the old colonel for years. He always refused. Said it was too important to sell. Important! It's nothing but 700 tons of scrap metal taking up good Texas soil." Dalton approached the nearest helicopter, memories flooding back of the few times his grandfather had spoken about his military service. The colonel had been chief engineer on some classified project, but he'd never shared details with the family. Now, standing in this graveyard of military hardware, Dalton wondered what secrets his grandfather had taken to his grave. He reached out and touched the helicopter's weather-beaten fuselage. Despite the surface rust, the metal felt solid beneath his fingers. Something about that didn't seem right, but he couldn't put his finger on what. More vehicles were arriving now, creating an impromptu audience at the gate. Dalton heard their whispered conversations, their barely concealed laughter. He was used to being underestimated. It had been happening ever since he'd lost his construction job 6 months ago and ended up living in his truck. But something about their dismissive attitude toward his grandfather's property bothered him more than their mockery of his own situation. "Hey, Marine," someone called out. "You need help hauling all this to the scrapyard? I know a guy who'll give you 10 cents on the pound." The comment drew laughter from the crowd, but Dalton remained focused on his inspection. He walked the perimeter of each helicopter, noting their positioning. the way they were arranged in a precise pattern despite their apparent abandonment. His grandfather had been many things: stern, secretive, difficult, but he had never been careless or disorganized. The sun was setting now, painting the rusty helicopters in shades of deep orange and purple. The crowd of onlookers gradually dispersed, having gotten their fill of entertainment for the day. Their departing comments drifted back to him. Poor fool. What a waste. Just like his crazy grandfather. Dalton stood in the center of the yard, surrounded by what appeared to be nothing but deteriorating military equipment. But as he watched the last rays of sunlight play across the curved surfaces of the helicopters, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this inheritance than met the eye. His grandfather, for all his faults, had been a brilliant engineer and a patriot to his core. Would he really leave behind nothing but worthless junk? As darkness settled over the property, Dalton walked back to his truck, the locals' mocking words still echoing in his mind. He had no idea what he was going to do with 40 acres of military scrap, but he knew one thing. He owed it to his grandfather's memory to at least try to understand why this place had been so important to him. Dalton had just settled into the cab of his truck, reviewing the property documents by flashlight, when headlights swept across the yard. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up beside his weathered pickup, its engine purring smoothly before falling silent. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, his silver hair catching the moonlight. Dalton Pierce? The man's voice was smooth and practiced. Harrison Blackwell, Blackwell Development Group. He extended a manicured hand through Dalton's open window. I've been very interested in this property for some time. Dalton shook the offered hand cautiously, noting the contrast between Blackwell's pristine appearance and the rusted military equipment surrounding them. You're out here pretty late, Mr. Blackwell. Please call me Harrison. Blackwell smiled, but it didn't reach his cold blue eyes. I heard you'd arrived to claim your inheritance. Word travels fast in small towns. He gestured at the surrounding scrapyard. I wanted to catch you before you waste too much time here. This property has some serious issues. What kind of issues? Dalton asked, his military instincts warning him that Blackwell's timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Environmental contamination, for one. Blackwell pulled out a leather-bound portfolio. These helicopters have been leaking hydraulic fluid and aviation fuel into the soil for decades. The cleanup costs alone would bankrupt you. He paused, letting that sink in. But I'm willing to take it off your hands. Let's say $50,000 cash. You could start fresh, get yourself a real place to live. The offer was clearly designed to prey on Dalton's current circumstances. That's very generous, he said carefully, but I think I need some time to assess the property myself. Blackwell's friendly demeanor cracked slightly, a flash of something harder showing through. Time is money, Mr. Pierce. And this offer won't last long. The property is worthless. Surely you can see that. I'm doing you a favor here. I appreciate the offer, Dalton replied firmly, but my answer is still no, at least for now. The developer's face hardened completely, his practiced charm vanishing. I don't think you understand your situation, Mr. Pierce. This property is going to be nothing but trouble for someone in your position. He straightened his tie. I strongly suggest you reconsider my offer. Without waiting for a response, Blackwell returned to his Mercedes and drove away, leaving Dalton with an uneasy feeling. The developer's shift from friendly to threatening had been subtle but unmistakable. Dalton spent the next hour securing the property gate and checking the perimeter fence. His Marine training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that something wasn't right. Why would a successful developer be so interested in a junkyard full of corroded military equipment? He finally settled into his truck for the night, the familiar discomfort of sleeping in the driver's seat a reminder of how far he'd fallen since losing his construction job. Still, his years of military service had taught him to sleep anywhere, and soon he drifted off. A sharp sound jolted him awake hours later. The digital clock on his dashboard read 3:15 in the morning. He stayed perfectly still, listening intently. There, another sound, metal scraping against metal. Dalton eased his door open silently and slipped out into the darkness. The quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate between the hulking shapes of the Apache helicopters. As his eyes adjusted, he caught movement near the property's eastern fence. Two figures in dark clothing were spray painting something on one of the helicopters. Dalton moved closer, using the shadows for cover, but by the time he reached the area, they were gone, likely escaped through a hole he found cut in the fence. Their message remained behind, stark red letters dripping on the helicopter's fuselage. Sell now or else. Dalton did a quick sweep of the property and found more vandalism. 3 other helicopters had been tagged with similar threatening messages. Worse, when he returned to his truck, he discovered all 4 tires had been slashed. He sat in his disabled vehicle, watching the sun rise over his vandalized inheritance. Blackwell's warning about trouble hadn't taken long to materialize. The developer clearly wanted this property badly enough to resort to intimidation, which only reinforced Dalton's growing suspicion that there was more here than met the eye. The question was, what could be so valuable about 7 rusted helicopters and a yard full of deteriorating military equipment that would drive a wealthy developer to such lengths to acquire it? Whatever his grandfather had been protecting here, Harrison Blackwell seemed determined to get his hands on it, by any means necessary. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when a dusty Prius pulled up to the scrapyard's gate. Dalton watched warily from beside his disabled truck as a young woman emerged, carrying a leather messenger bag and what looked like camera equipment. After the night's vandalism, he wasn't taking any chances with unexpected visitors. She approached confidently, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Mr. Pierce, I'm Rebecca Chen from the State University's Military History Department." She held up her university ID. "I heard about your inheritance through our Veterans Network. I'm working on my doctoral dissertation about Cold War aircraft, and I'd love to document these helicopters." Dalton studied her earnest expression. Unlike Blackwell's practiced charm, her enthusiasm seemed genuine. "Not the best timing," he said, gesturing to the spray-painted threats and his slashed tires. "Had some unwelcome visitors last night?" Rebecca's eyes widened as she took in the vandalism. "That's terrible. Is this about the developer who's been trying to buy up all the land around here?" She set down her equipment and moved closer to examine the nearest helicopter. "Oh my gosh, this is fascinating." "Fascinating isn't the word most people use," Dalton said, watching her circle the aircraft with growing excitement. "Most call it junk." "Are you kidding? These aren't standard AH-64 Apaches." Rebecca pointed to several features on the helicopter's frame. "See these modifications? The nose configuration is all wrong. And these attachment points? I've never seen anything like this in the official specs." For the first time since receiving his inheritance, Dalton felt a spark of genuine interest. "What do you mean, modifications?" "Look here." Rebecca traced her hand along an unusual seam in the fuselage. "Standard Apaches don't have these panels. And the rotor assembly, it's completely different from the documented designs." She pulled out a tablet and showed him technical diagrams. "These helicopters have been seriously modified. The question is why?" Dalton thought about Blackwell's aggressive interest in the property. Could these modifications make them valuable? Historically? Absolutely. Rebecca was already taking photographs, especially if they're tied to classified Cold War programs. The military developed all sorts of experimental aircraft during that period. She paused, looking at him intently. "Your grandfather? He was Colonel Marcus Pierce, right? Did he ever mention anything about special projects?" "We weren't exactly close," Dalton admitted. "I always thought he abandoned the family for his military career. We hadn't spoken in years when he died." Rebecca's expression softened with understanding. Sometimes the most important military contributions had to be kept secret, even from family. Maybe there was more to his story? Before Dalton could respond, a black SUV roared up to the gate. Two men in tactical gear emerged, private security badges visible on their vests. "Mr. Pierce," the larger man called out, "Mr. Blackwell sent us to check on the property. There were reports of suspicious activity last night." "You mean the vandalism your people probably caused?" Dalton positioned himself between the men and Rebecca, who was quietly continuing to photograph the helicopters. The security guard smiled coldly. "We're just here to help, sir. Mr. Blackwell is concerned about liability issues with unauthorized visitors on the contaminated property." He looked pointedly at Rebecca. "I have proper credentials," Rebecca spoke up, holding out her university ID. "And I seriously doubt this property is contaminated. These aircraft have been carefully preserved, not abandoned." The guards exchanged glances. "Nevertheless, we'll need to document any unauthorized access. For insurance purposes." "This is private property," Dalton said firmly, his military bearing evident despite his worn clothes. "Unless you have a warrant, you need to leave." The guards hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. Finally, the spokesman shrugged. "Have it your way, Mr. Pierce, but Mr. Blackwell won't be happy about this interference with his security duties." After they left, Rebecca turned to Dalton. "They weren't really here about security, were they?" "No," Dalton said grimly. "Blackwell's trying to pressure me into selling, but after what you've shown me about these helicopters, I'm even more convinced there's something here worth protecting." "I can help," Rebecca offered. "The university has extensive military archives, and I have contacts in the defense history community. We can research these modifications, try to figure out what made your grandfather protect these helicopters so carefully." Dalton looked at the young historian, seeing real understanding in her eyes. Unlike everyone else who'd mocked his inheritance or tried to steal it, she recognized its true value went beyond money. "I'd appreciate that," he said. "Right now, I could use an ally who sees more than just junk." Rebecca smiled, already pulling out her notebook. "Let's start with the serial numbers. If these were part of a classified program, there might be records we can trace." The manila envelope landed on Dalton's truck seat with a thud. Inside were official-looking documents from the Environmental Protection Agency, citing multiple violations that seemed deliberately vague. Phrases like potential contamination and hazardous materials jumped out at him. At the bottom, a notice demanded immediate action or face thousands of dollars in daily fines. "This has Blackwell written all over it," Dalton muttered, starting his recently repaired truck. He headed straight to City Hall, the morning traffic doing nothing to calm his rising anger. The municipal building's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dalton approached the permits counter. A bored-looking clerk barely glanced up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "I need to contest these EPA violations." Dalton spread the papers on the counter. "They're completely unfounded. I inherited this property less than a week ago." The clerk's expression shifted from indifference to thinly veiled hostility. "You'll need to file an appeal with the Environmental Review Board." She slid a thick stack of forms across the counter. "Processing time is 6 to 8 weeks. Meanwhile, the fines will continue to accumulate." "That's ridiculous," Dalton protested. "Can I speak to someone in charge?" "Commissioner Thompson is very busy," she said, though Dalton hadn't mentioned any names. "You'll need to follow proper procedures." For the next 2 hours, Dalton was shuffled between offices, each person more unhelpful than the last. Every request was met with new forms, additional fees, or complicated procedures that seemed designed to waste time. The message was clear. The system was working against him. In the hallway, he overheard two officials speaking in low voices around a corner. "Blackwell says to keep him tied up in paperwork? Yeah, the usual arrangement. Property will be condemned before he can fight it." Dalton's hands clenched into fists. The corruption was so obvious it was almost insulting. He left City Hall knowing he'd get no help there. The sun was setting when he returned to the scrapyard. As he pulled through the gate, 3 black SUVs blocked his path. 6 men in tactical gear emerged, led by the same security guard from before. "Mr. Pierce," the leader called out, his fake smile gone. "Mr. Blackwell is losing patience. We're here to conduct a thorough environmental inspection." "Like hell you are." Dalton stepped out of his truck, his military training kicking in as he assessed the threat. The men were spreading out, trying to surround him. "Don't make this difficult," the leader said, advancing slowly. "Accidents happen on contaminated properties. People get hurt." Dalton backed away, keeping the nearest helicopter between himself and the approaching men. His eyes darted between their faces, noting their positions. These weren't regular security guards. They moved with too much precision. The first punch came from his left. Dalton deflected it, his Marine combat training taking over. He drove an elbow into his attacker's ribs, then spun away from a second man's grab. But there were too many. A boot caught his knee, sending him stumbling backward. Through the pain, Dalton spotted his only escape route, the open cockpit of the nearest Apache. Without hesitation, he grabbed the handholds and pulled himself up, muscle memory from countless helicopter drills guiding his movements. His attackers tried to follow, but the Apache's access points were designed for trained pilots. The narrow passages and awkward angles that Dalton navigated smoothly became obstacles for his pursuers. Inside the cockpit, Dalton's fingers instinctively found familiar controls. Everything felt different from standard military aircraft, yet somehow familiar. The modifications Rebecca had pointed out were even more apparent from this position. "Get him out of there," the leader shouted. "Don't damage the equipment." That command made Dalton pause. Why would hired thugs care about damaging supposedly worthless scrap metal? A hand grabbed his ankle. Dalton kicked free, connecting with someone's face. There was a cry of pain, followed by cursing. The security team's coordinated assault fell apart as they struggled with the helicopter's unusual configuration. "Fall back!" The leader's voice carried an edge of panic. "We can't risk damaging the... Just fall back!" Dalton waited in the cockpit until he heard the SUVs drive away. His knee throbbed where he'd been kicked, and his knuckles were scraped raw. But as he carefully climbed down, his mind was racing. These men weren't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They'd been ready to cause serious harm. Yet they'd retreated rather than risk damaging the helicopter. Combined with Rebecca's observations about the modifications, it painted a disturbing picture. His grandfather hadn't left him a scrapyard full of junk. He'd left him something valuable enough that people were willing to kill for it. The question was, what were these helicopters really hiding? Still perched in the Apache's cockpit, Dalton ran his hands over the control panel, his breathing finally steadying after the confrontation. Something felt off about the instrumentation. Subtle differences his muscle memory from flight training picked up. The standard gauges were there, but additional displays and controls had been integrated so seamlessly they almost looked original. "This isn't standard military issue," he muttered, leaning closer to examine a row of unusual switches. The sun had nearly set when Rebecca's blue sedan pulled up to the gate. She hurried over, her face etched with concern. "Dalton, are you okay? I saw those SUVs leaving." "I'm fine," he called down, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Come up here. I need your eyes on something." Rebecca climbed up carefully, settling into the gunner's seat behind him. "What am I looking at?" "Everything about this cockpit is slightly different from a regular Apache. The controls, the panel layout." He pointed to a section near the weapon systems. "See these markings?" She leaned forward, squinting in the fading light. "Wait." She pulled out her phone, using it as a flashlight. "These aren't standard military identification codes. They're classified markings. I've seen similar ones in my research, but never this exact configuration. Can you trace them?" "I'll need to make some calls. Check with my contacts at the Air Force Historical Research Agency." She was already taking photos. "These modifications look intentional, not aftermarket changes." They spent the next hour documenting everything they could find that differed from standard Apache specifications. Rebecca's expertise helped identify subtle alterations that Dalton's practical experience might have missed. The next morning, Rebecca arrived early, clutching a thick folder and practically vibrating with excitement. "You're not going to believe what I found." They sat in Dalton's truck, spreading papers across the dashboard. "I called in every favor I had," she explained. "Most of my contacts hit brick walls, but one retired archivist remembered something called Project Phantom Wing from the 1980s. Never heard of it. Because officially, it never existed." She pulled out a heavily redacted document. It was an ultra-classified program running from 1983 to 1987. They were developing stealth modifications for Apache helicopters. Dalton's eyebrows shot up. Stealth Apaches? In the 80s? The technology was ahead of its time. Way ahead. Rebecca's eyes sparkled with academic enthusiasm. They developed special coatings and structural modifications that could reduce radar signatures by up to 80%. But the program was officially terminated in 1987. All prototypes were supposedly destroyed. "Supposedly," Dalton repeated, looking out at the 7 massive helicopters rusting in his scrapyard. "According to every official record, these aircraft don't exist." She spread out more papers, grainy photographs, technical diagrams, and what looked like parts of maintenance manuals. But the modifications match perfectly. These are Phantom Wing prototypes, preserved somehow for over 30 years. Dalton sat back, his mind racing. My grandfather, he must have been involved with the program, found a way to save them when it was shut down. "But why?" Rebecca asked. "And why leave them to you now?" "I don't know." Dalton rubbed his face. "We barely spoke after my parents died. I always thought he abandoned the family, but maybe..." He trailed off, remembering the last time he'd seen Colonel Pierce. There had been something his grandfather wanted to tell him, but Dalton had been too angry to listen. Rebecca touched his arm gently. "These helicopters represent a huge piece of classified military history, technology that was decades ahead of its time. No wonder Blackwell's so desperate to get his hands on them. He must have figured out what they are." Dalton's jaw tightened. "But how?" "The real question is, what do we do now?" Rebecca gathered the documents carefully. "This isn't just about property rights anymore. These aircraft are still technically classified technology." Dalton looked at the helicopters with new understanding. They weren't just his inheritance or a connection to his grandfather. They were a military secret that had been carefully preserved for over 30 years. Their value went far beyond money. "We need to protect them," he said firmly. "Whatever my grandfather's reasons were for saving them, he trusted me to keep them safe. I won't let Blackwell or anyone else get their hands on them." Rebecca nodded, her expression serious. "I'll keep digging. Try to find out more about the program and why it was really shut down. There has to be more to this story." As they sat there, surrounded by papers revealing a decades-old military secret, Dalton felt the weight of his grandfather's trust settling on his shoulders. The old man hadn't abandoned his duty. He'd been guarding these secrets all along. Now that responsibility had passed to Dalton. He looked at the helicopters, their massive frames silhouetted against the morning sky. To everyone else, they looked like worthless scrap metal. But now he knew better. Hidden beneath their rusted exterior was technology that had been years ahead of its time, preserved by a man who had sacrificed his family relationships to keep them safe. Rebecca burst through the scrapyard gate the next morning, her car kicking up dust as she skidded to a stop. She jumped out, clutching her laptop and a thick manila envelope. "I found him," she called out, rushing toward where Dalton was examining one of the helicopters. "Your grandfather. I found out what he really did." Dalton climbed down from the maintenance ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans. Rebecca's excitement was contagious, her eyes bright with discovery. "Look at this." She opened her laptop on the hood of his truck, pulling up scanned documents. Colonel Marcus Pierce wasn't just involved in Project Phantom Wing. He was the chief engineer. The whole program was his baby. Dalton leaned in, studying the old photographs. There was his grandfather, 30 years younger, but still bearing that stern military bearing, standing proudly next to what looked like a prototype helicopter. The image was grainy, but the determination in the colonel's eyes was unmistakable. The technology they developed was revolutionary, Rebecca continued, scrolling through technical specifications. These coatings and structural modifications, they're still classified because they're still relevant today. Modern defense contractors would pay hundreds of millions of dollars to get their hands on these designs. That's why Blackwell wants the property so badly, Dalton said, pieces clicking into place. He must have connections who told him what these really are. Rebecca nodded. Your grandfather didn't just work on the project, he saved it. When Soviet spies nearly infiltrated the program in 1987, he orchestrated an elaborate cover-up. The official termination, the supposed destruction of the prototypes, it was all staged to protect the technology. Dalton sat heavily on his truck's tailgate, memories of his grandfather flooding back. All those years of silence, the cold distance, the rumors that he'd embezzled military funds before retiring. He sacrificed everything to keep these safe, including his relationship with his family, Rebecca said gently. The classified nature of the project meant he couldn't tell anyone what he was really doing. He had to let people think the worst of him. I thought he was just a bitter old man who abandoned us after my parents died. Dalton's voice was rough with emotion, but he was protecting something bigger than himself, something that mattered to national security. Rebecca spread more documents across the truck bed. These helicopters represent decades of classified military technology. The stealth capabilities were so advanced that even modern systems haven't fully caught up. If this fell into the wrong hands, it won't, Dalton said firmly. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts he hadn't called in years. I know some people who can help. Over the next few hours, Dalton made call after call to his old Marine unit, men he'd served with, fought beside, trusted with his life. Each conversation started awkwardly. It had been years after all. But as soon as he explained the situation, their responses were immediate and unanimous. You need backup, Staff Sergeant? I'm there. Just tell me when and where, Pierce. Finally got something worth fighting for again, huh? Count me in. By sunset, Dalton had assembled a team of 8 combat veterans, all willing to drop everything and help protect the property. These were men who understood duty, who recognized the importance of keeping military technology out of enemy hands. My guys will start arriving tomorrow, Dalton told Rebecca as they watched the sun sink behind the helicopters. We'll set up rotating patrols, proper security protocols. No more midnight vandalism from Blackwell's thugs. It's amazing, Rebecca said, looking at the old photographs again. Your grandfather spent decades guarding these secrets alone. Now you're bringing in a whole team to continue his mission. Dalton picked up one of the photos, studying his grandfather's face. The stern expression he'd always interpreted as disapproval now looked different, like the face of a man carrying a heavy burden, one he couldn't share even with those he loved most. I wish I'd known, he said quietly. All those years I was angry at him, thinking he'd abandoned us. He was really protecting something vital to national security, something he believed in enough to sacrifice everything else. And now he's trusted you to continue that protection, Rebecca pointed out. He could have sold the technology, taken the money and run. Instead, he preserved it all these years and left it to you. He must have seen something in you that he recognized, that same sense of duty, of doing what's right no matter the personal cost. Dalton nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his grandfather's trust settle more firmly on his shoulders. The inheritance wasn't just land and helicopters. It was a mission, a responsibility to protect something bigger than himself. As the last light faded, he looked at the massive shapes of the helicopters, their secrets hidden beneath decades of carefully cultivated rust and neglect. His grandfather had spent 30 years protecting this technology, letting the world think he was a bitter failure rather than reveal the truth. Tomorrow, his fellow Marines would arrive, and the real work of defending his grandfather's legacy would begin. But tonight, Dalton finally understood the true nature of his inheritance. Not just property, but purpose. The next morning, pickup trucks and weathered SUVs began arriving at the scrapyard before dawn. One by one, Dalton's former Marine unit members pulled in, each vehicle carrying supplies and determination. These weren't the polished corporate security types Blackwell employed. They were battle-tested veterans who knew how to secure a position with limited resources. Mike Torres, who'd been Dalton's radio operator in Afghanistan, immediately began setting up communications equipment. "First thing we need is eyes and ears everywhere," he said, unpacking surveillance cameras and motion sensors. No more surprises from unwanted visitors. Jake Wilson, their former demolitions expert, walked the perimeter with Dalton, pointing out vulnerable spots. "We can funnel any approach through these 3 corridors," he explained, sketching a rough map. "Makes it easier to monitor who's coming and going." Rebecca worked from her laptop in Dalton's truck, making calls to her academic contacts and military archives. "I've reached out to some people at the Pentagon's Historical Division," she told Dalton during a break. "They're interested in authenticating the aircraft, but we need to be careful. If word gets out too quickly about what these really are, it could bring even more unwanted attention," Dalton finished. He watched his team setting up their defensive positions with practiced efficiency. It felt good to be working with professionals again, people who understood military precision and discipline. By mid-afternoon, Torres called everyone to the makeshift command center they'd established in one of the more stable storage sheds. "You need to see this," he said, his expression grim. On his laptop screen, he showed them what his initial security sweep had uncovered. "Found these hidden around the perimeter," he said, holding up 3 sophisticated surveillance devices. "This isn't amateur hour stuff. This is professional-grade intelligence gathering equipment. Corporate security wouldn't have access to gear like this," Wilson added, examining one of the devices. "This is serious tradecraft." Rebecca's phone buzzed with an incoming email. Her face paled as she read it. "My contact at the Pentagon just got back to me. They ran background checks on Harris and Blackwell." She looked up at Dalton. "He's not just a developer. They've linked him to at least 3 foreign intelligence networks. He's been on their watch list for suspected technology theft for years." The implications hit Dalton like a physical blow. "They've been looking for these helicopters all this time," he said. "My grandfather didn't just hide them from the Soviets 30 years ago. He kept them hidden from every foreign intelligence service that came after." "And now Blackwell's found them?" Torres said. "Question is, which country is he planning to sell them to?" Wilson pulled up satellite imagery of the surrounding area on his tablet. "Look at these heat signatures from the hills overlooking the property. They've got multiple observation posts set up. We're being watched right now." The team gathered around the maps, falling naturally into their old military roles. They identified likely approaches, discussed patrol schedules, and established emergency protocols. This wasn't just about protecting property anymore. It was about preventing classified military technology from falling into enemy hands. "We need to document everything," Rebecca said, spreading out her research materials. "Every modification, every serial number, every piece of equipment. The Pentagon needs to know exactly what we're dealing with. And we need to figure out who Blackwell's working with," Torres added. "Foreign intelligence operators don't play by the same rules as corporate thugs. They won't just try to pressure us out. They'll take what they want by force if they have to." Dalton looked at the faces of his team, men he'd trusted with his life in combat zones halfway around the world. Now they were defending American soil, protecting military secrets on his grandfather's property. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Set up round-the-clock patrols," he ordered. 2-person teams, rotating shifts. I want every approach covered, every visitor logged. If Blackwell or his people try anything, we need to be ready." "What about the local authorities?" Rebecca asked. "Should we try to involve them?" Wilson shook his head. Blackwell's already got them in his pocket. Besides, this is beyond local jurisdiction now. This is national security. Throughout the afternoon, the team fortified their positions. They concealed cameras in strategic locations, established secure communication channels, and mapped out emergency evacuation routes. Rebecca continued her authentication work, carefully photographing and documenting every unique feature of the stealth helicopters. As evening approached, Torres picked up unusual radio traffic on his monitoring equipment. "They're definitely out there," he reported. "Multiple teams using encrypted channels. These aren't amateurs we're dealing with." Dalton stood at the perimeter fence, watching the sun set behind the hills, where foreign agents were surely watching them through high-powered optics. His grandfather had spent decades protecting these secrets alone. Now the responsibility had passed to him, but at least he had backup. Good men who understood what was at stake. The property dispute with Blackwell had evolved into something far more serious. This wasn't about real estate anymore. It was about protecting classified military technology from foreign intelligence services that had been hunting it for decades. The scrapyard had become a battlefield in a silent war, one that had been going on since before Dalton was born. The attack came just after midnight. The first warning was a series of soft pops as the perimeter sensors went dark, one by one. Torres noticed immediately from his monitoring station. "Multiple breaches, all sectors," he called over the radio. "They're using professional gear to take down our security system." Dalton was already moving, his military training kicking in as he directed his team to defensive positions. The scrapyard's maze of metal and machinery that had seemed like a liability now became their advantage, creating natural choke points and cover positions. Three-man teams approaching from the north and east, Wilson reported from his observation post. Night vision equipment, military-grade weapons. These aren't Blackwell's regular thugs. Rebecca quickly gathered her research materials and locked them in a secure container. "I'm seeing movement on the western approach too," she said, watching through the night vision binoculars Dalton had given her. "They're trying to surround us." The first shots came as dark figures moved between the rusted helicopters. The sound of suppressed weapons echoed through the scrapyard as the mercenaries tried to advance under cover of darkness, but Dalton's team was ready. "Contact front," shouted Martinez from his position near the main gate. The crack of return fire split the night as the Marines engaged their attackers. Dalton moved through the familiar chaos of combat, directing his men with hand signals and short radio bursts. The mercenaries were good. Their movements showed professional training, but they didn't know the terrain like Dalton's team did. Every pile of scrap, every corroded vehicle, every abandoned helicopter had been mapped and memorized during their preparations. "They're trying to reach Helicopter 3, Torres called out. "That's the one with the most intact stealth panels." Dalton keyed his radio. "Wilson, Martinez, shift fire to protect that aircraft. Everyone else, keep them contained." The firefight intensified as the mercenaries realized they'd lost the element of surprise. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as bullets sparked off metal surfaces. The sound of gunfire echoed off the surrounding hills, creating a confusing cacophony of noise. From her secured position in the command center, Rebecca was on the phone with her Pentagon contact. "We're under attack," she reported. "We need immediate support." She stopped suddenly, her face going pale as she listened to the response. "What do you mean the local authorities have been ordered to stand down?" A grenade detonated near one of the helicopters, showering the area with sparks. Dalton's team had prepared for this, positioning fire extinguishers nearby to prevent any damage to the aircraft. Martinez quickly doused the flames while Wilson provided covering fire. "They're falling back," Torres announced after 20 minutes of intense fighting. "Multiple casualties on their side. They're retreating to their vehicles." Dalton moved carefully through the scrapyard, checking on his men. Incredibly, none of his team had been seriously injured. Their preparation and positioning had paid off. But the attack had been too well coordinated, too professional. "Rebecca," he called over the radio, "what did your Pentagon contact say?" Her voice was tight with anger when she responded. "Someone high up issued orders to local law enforcement to ignore any disturbance at this location tonight. They knew this attack was coming." The team regrouped at the command center as dawn approached. Shell casings littered the ground, and the acrid smell of gun smoke still hung in the air. Torres was analyzing radio transmissions he'd intercepted during the fight. "They were using military protocols," he reported. "These weren't just mercenaries. Some of them were former special forces, maybe even current operators working off the books." Wilson laid out photos he'd taken of equipment the attackers had dropped in their retreat. "This is serious hardware. The kind of gear you only get through official channels or very high-level black market connections." "Blackwell has people inside the Pentagon," Rebecca said, showing them the messages on her phone. "My contact warned me that several officials have been accessing classified files about Project Phantom Wing. Files that were supposed to be sealed." Dalton studied the battle damage around them. The attackers had been specifically targeting the helicopters with the most intact stealth technology. They knew exactly what they were looking for. "This was just the first attempt," he said grimly. "Now that they know we can defend the site, they'll try other tactics. And with corrupt Pentagon officials helping them, we can't trust anyone outside this team," Torres finished. "Not until we know how deep this goes." The morning sun revealed the full extent of the night's battle. Bullet holes marked the shipping containers they'd used for cover. Spent shell casings glinted in the dirt, but the helicopters, and their precious technological secrets, remained secure. Dalton's grandfather had defended these secrets alone for decades. Now Dalton understood why. The technology hidden in these rusting airframes was worth killing for, and there were powerful people willing to do just that to get their hands on it. Dalton knelt in the main hangar, running his hands along the concrete floor where he'd noticed an unusual seam. The morning sun streamed through the damaged roof, illuminating decades of dust and debris. But something about this section of flooring had caught his eye. It was too uniform, too purposefully placed. "Rebecca, bring that light over here," he called out. She approached with the powerful LED flashlight, directing its beam where Dalton indicated. "See these marks?" He traced his finger along barely visible grooves. "These aren't random cracks. They're too straight, too precise." Torres joined them, examining the pattern. "It's a hatch," he said, his eyes widening. "Cleverly disguised, but definitely man-made." It took them 20 minutes to find the hidden release mechanism, concealed within what appeared to be a regular electrical junction box. When they finally triggered it, the concrete panel lifted with a grinding sound, revealing a steep stairway descending into darkness. "Your grandfather was thorough," Rebecca said, shining her light down the stairs. "This doesn't show up on any of the building plans." Dalton led the way down, his flashlight beam revealing metal walls covered in decades of undisturbed dust. At the bottom, they found themselves in a workshop that looked frozen in time. Drafting tables held yellowed technical drawings. Filing cabinets lined the walls. Tools still hung neatly on pegboards, waiting for hands that had last touched them 30 years ago. "Look at this," Rebecca breathed, approaching one of the drafting tables. "These are the original design specifications for the stealth modifications." She carefully lifted one of the drawings, revealing more documents underneath. "These are classified documents, eyes-only material that was supposed to have been destroyed." Dalton moved to a desk in the corner that somehow seemed more personal than the others. A framed photograph caught his attention. His grandfather, much younger, standing proudly next to one of the Apache helicopters. But it was the leather-bound journal beside it that made his hands tremble slightly as he picked it up. "I found something," he said quietly. The journal's pages were filled with his grandfather's precise handwriting. As Dalton began to read, the true story of Project Phantom Wing emerged from decades of secrecy. "It wasn't canceled," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The project was buried because they discovered a Soviet mole in the Pentagon. Someone high up in military intelligence was feeding information to Moscow. Rebecca moved closer, looking over his shoulder at the journal. That explains why there's no official record of what really happened. Dalton continued reading, his grandfather's words painting a picture of impossible choices and heavy burdens. He knew the stealth technology was too valuable to risk falling into Soviet hands, but he also knew the mole had enough influence to access any official storage facility. He turned another page, his hands trembling slightly. So he faked the destruction of the helicopters, made it look like they'd been scrapped and melted down. That's why he bought this property, Torres said, understanding dawning on his face. Hidden in plain sight? Who would look for classified military aircraft in a civilian scrapyard? More entries in the journal revealed the personal cost of Colonel Pierce's deception. He'd been branded as difficult, paranoid, possibly even unstable by his Pentagon colleagues. His insistence on maintaining control of the scrapyard had strained his family relationships to the breaking point. He couldn't tell anyone the truth, Dalton said softly, reading his grandfather's private thoughts. Not his superiors, not his friends, not even his family. He knew the technology would be vital for America's future defense, but protecting it meant sacrificing everything else. Rebecca squeezed his shoulder gently. He was a true patriot. He gave up his reputation, his relationships, everything to protect these secrets. Dalton sat heavily in his grandfather's chair, decades of misunderstanding and resentment crumbling as he finally saw the truth. The man he'd believed had abandoned his family had actually been carrying out perhaps the most important mission of his life, one that required him to appear as nothing more than an eccentric recluse obsessed with his worthless scrapyard. "There's more," he said, turning to the final pages. Technical specifications, maintenance procedures, everything needed to preserve the stealth technology. He kept detailed records of it all, hidden away down here where no one could find it. Torres was examining the filing cabinets, many still bearing their original classified markings. "This isn't just historical data," he said. "Some of this technology is still more advanced than anything currently in service. No wonder Blackwell's people were willing to kill for it." Dalton closed the journal carefully, looking around the workshop with new eyes. Every tool, every document, every careful preparation spoke of his grandfather's dedication to his secret mission. The man had sacrificed everything, including his relationship with his grandson, to protect something bigger than himself. "I never knew him," Dalton said quietly. "Not really. All these years, I thought he'd pushed us away because he didn't care. But he was protecting us, protecting everyone, the only way he could." The hidden workshop had preserved not just classified technology, but the truth about Colonel Marcus Pierce's legacy. In trying to understand his inheritance, Dalton had finally discovered who his grandfather really was, a man who had chosen a lonely path of duty and sacrifice in service to his country. The FBI's mobile command center hummed with activity outside the scrapyard gates. Agents in dark suits moved purposefully between vehicles, coordinating with military personnel and other government representatives. Dalton watched the controlled chaos from his grandfather's workshop, feeling increasingly overwhelmed by the competing interests surrounding him. "They're all circling like vultures," Torres said, standing beside him at the window. "Pentagon wants the tech back under wraps. Defense contractors want to study it. Intelligence agencies want to know how it stayed hidden so long." Dalton rubbed his tired eyes. The past 48 hours had been a blur of interviews, briefings, and thinly veiled demands from various officials. Each agency claimed jurisdiction. Each one wanted exclusive control, and none of them seemed to fully trust the others. "At least Rebecca's research is helping sort out the authentication process," Dalton said, glancing at his phone. She had texted an hour ago about meeting with military archivists to verify the documentation they'd found. A sharp knock interrupted them. Agent Sarah Martinez, the FBI's lead investigator, entered with her usual direct manner. We've confirmed foreign intelligence activity connected to Blackwell's organization. He's been in contact with at least 3 different nations trying to auction off the stealth technology. So arrest him? Dalton said firmly. Martinez shook her head. We need concrete evidence linking him directly to the espionage. Right now, everything's through intermediaries. He's careful. A commotion outside drew their attention. One of Dalton's Marine teammates rushed in, his face tight with concern. Boss, Rebecca's not answering her phone. She never made it to the military archives for her afternoon meeting. Dalton's blood ran cold. He tried calling her number, but it went straight to voicemail. Track her phone, he ordered, but Martinez was already ahead of him, speaking rapidly into her radio. 20 minutes later, they found Rebecca's car abandoned in a parking lot 2 miles away. Her phone and bag were still inside, but there was no sign of struggle. As Dalton stood staring at her empty vehicle, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message contained a video. Rebecca sat in a bare room, looking frightened but unharmed. Blackwell's voice came from off-camera. It's simple, Pierce. The helicopters and all technical documentation in exchange for the historian. You have 3 hours. Dalton's hands shook with rage as he showed the video to Martinez. We need to move now. We're tracking the video's origin, she said, but her expression was grim. Blackwell's too smart to make it easy. He'll have multiple layers of protection. I'm not waiting for bureaucrats to argue jurisdiction while Rebecca's in danger. Dalton turned to Torres. Get the team ready, full tactical gear. Martinez stepped in front of him. This is now an FBI operation. You can't just... Those helicopters stayed hidden for 30 years because my grandfather understood that sometimes official channels aren't enough. Dalton cut her off. Rebecca's life is worth more than jurisdictional disputes. His phone buzzed again. Another message with coordinates and a warning. Come alone. No law enforcement. Any sign of FBI or military involvement? She dies. Torres studied the coordinates on a map. Industrial district, lots of empty warehouses. Perfect for an ambush. He'll expect me to bring proof of the technical specifications, Dalton said, mind racing. We can use that. While I'm meeting with Blackwell, the team can... This is exactly what he wants, Martinez interrupted. He's forcing you to make a personal choice instead of a tactical one. Dalton looked at Rebecca's empty car, remembering all the hours they'd spent researching together, her passion for preserving history, the way her eyes lit up when discovering new details about the helicopters. Somewhere between examining classified documents and defending the scrapyard, he'd fallen in love with her brilliant mind and brave heart. You're right, he told Martinez. This is personal. Blackwell made it personal when he took her. He turned to his team. But that doesn't mean we have to play by his rules. Torres nodded grimly. We've got your back, boss. Whatever the plan. Dalton looked at the FBI agent. I know you have to follow procedure, but Rebecca's running out of time, and Blackwell has proven he's willing to kill. Martinez studied him for a long moment, then spoke into her radio. All units maintain current positions. No additional surveillance of the target area. She turned back to Dalton. Officially, we're continuing our investigation here at the scrapyard. Whatever happens in the industrial district, we won't know about it until after the fact. Thank you, Dalton said quietly. Just remember, Blackwell's desperate. He's lost his corporate connections, his legitimate business contacts. All he has left is the possibility of selling this technology to foreign buyers. That makes him more dangerous than ever. Dalton checked his weapon and nodded to his team. Blackwell wanted to make this personal? Fine. Let's show him just how personal it can get. The stakes had shifted dramatically from protecting classified technology to saving the woman he loved. As Dalton and his Marines prepared for battle, he silently promised both Rebecca and his grandfather that he would prove worthy of their trust. The helicopters might be worth millions, but Rebecca's life was priceless. The industrial district loomed dark and forbidding in the twilight. Dalton crouched behind a rusted shipping container, studying the warehouse where Blackwell held Rebecca. His Marine team had positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter, waiting for his signal. "All teams in position?" Torres whispered through the radio. "Warehouse has 2 main entrances, 3 emergency exits, and a loading dock. Guards posted at each point." What Blackwell didn't know was that Dalton hadn't come empty-handed. Before leaving the scrapyard, he and his team had salvaged key components from the stealth helicopter's advanced sensor systems. The 30-year-old technology still worked perfectly, giving them a crucial advantage. "Activating thermal imaging now," Dalton said quietly. The portable display screen showed multiple heat signatures inside the warehouse. "I count 12 hostiles. Rebecca's in the northwest corner. Separate room. 2 guards with her." "Ready on your go, boss," Martinez replied. Though officially uninvolved, she had quietly provided them with tactical gear and communications equipment borrowed from the FBI's mobile command center. Dalton touched the folded papers in his vest pocket, carefully selected technical specifications that looked convincing but revealed nothing truly classified. The real documents remained secure in his grandfather's workshop. He took a deep breath, channeling years of combat experience. "Execute Plan Alpha. 3, 2, 1, mark." The assault began with precise coordination. Torres's team triggered a series of small explosions on the warehouse's south side, harmless but loud enough to draw attention. As guards rushed to investigate, Dalton's group moved in from the north, using the stealth system's sensor data to avoid patrols. They encountered the first resistance at a side entrance. 2 of Blackwell's mercenaries opened fire, but Dalton's team was ready. Non-lethal rubber rounds dropped both men before they could radio for help. "Moving to Sector 2, Dalton whispered. The thermal imaging showed Rebecca's guards getting anxious, but they maintained their position. Suddenly, Blackwell's voice crackled through the warehouse PA system. "I know you're here, Pierce. You have 30 seconds to surrender before the historian dies." Dalton signaled his team to hold position. "Keep moving as planned. He's bluffing. He needs her alive as leverage." The rescue operation continued with military precision. Team 2 created another diversion with flashbangs, while Dalton's group pushed toward Rebecca's location. The stealth system's sensors proved invaluable, letting them track enemy movements in real time. They breached the room, holding Rebecca with explosive force. Her 2 guards went down under precise fire before they could react. She was tied to a chair, but otherwise unharmed. "Took you long enough," she said with shaky bravado, as Dalton cut her restraints. "Sorry for the delay. Traffic was terrible." He helped her up, checking quickly for injuries. "Can you walk?" "I'm fine, but Blackwell, he was just here. He took files from his office." Dalton's blood ran cold. "What files?" "Technical documents. He said they were from the helicopters. He's meeting buyers tonight." "Torres," Dalton barked into his radio. "Blackwell's on the move with stolen specs. Find him." But even as his team swept the warehouse, Dalton knew Blackwell had planned his escape carefully. They found his office ransacked, a hidden door leading to underground tunnels standing open. "Multiple exit points," Torres reported. He could be anywhere by now. Rebecca leaned against Dalton as they emerged from the warehouse. "I'm sorry, I should have been more careful. He knew exactly when to grab me." "This isn't your fault." Dalton held her close, relief at her safety warring with anger at Blackwell's escape. "We'll find him." Martinez was waiting at their rally point, looking grim. "Border Patrol's been alerted, but Blackwell has too many connections. If those specs contain actual classified data..." "They do." Rebecca's voice was tight. "I saw them. Design schematics for the stealth modifications, radar cross-section data, everything the foreign buyers would need to understand how the technology works." Dalton thought of his grandfather, dedicating his life to protecting these secrets. Now, because he'd focused on saving Rebecca, that sacrifice might be undone. "We got what mattered most," Torres said quietly. squeezing Dalton's shoulder. "The lady's safe. We'll deal with Blackwell." But as they drove back to the scrapyard, Dalton couldn't shake the weight of failure. His grandfather had guarded these secrets for 30 years, giving up everything, including his family, to keep them secure. Now, in a single night, some of that technology had fallen into enemy hands. Rebecca seemed to read his thoughts. "Your grandfather would have made the same choice," she said softly. "Saving a life over protecting secrets?" Dalton pulled her closer. She was right. Having her safe beside him mattered more than any classified documents. But he also knew this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, Blackwell was meeting with foreign agents preparing to sell American military technology to the highest bidder. The rescue mission had succeeded, but at a cost. Now they faced an even greater challenge: stopping Blackwell before he could share the stealth helicopter's secrets with America's enemies. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded the scrapyard in deep shadows. Dalton and his team had worked through the night, fortifying their positions among the helicopters, knowing Blackwell wouldn't wait long to make his final move. Rebecca worked alongside them, helping to set up their limited defensive equipment. "Movement at the perimeter," Torres reported through their radio channel. "Multiple vehicles approaching from 3 directions. These aren't local thugs. They're using military-style formations." Dalton peered through his night vision goggles. Black-clad figures moved with professional precision, carrying advanced weapons that glinted in the dim light. He counted at least 40 attackers, all equipped with tactical gear that rivaled Special Forces units. "They're not even trying to hide anymore," Martinez whispered from her position. "This is a full military assault." "Everyone hold positions," Dalton ordered. "Remember your sectors of fire. Make every shot count." His 8-person team was severely outnumbered, but they had the advantage of knowing the terrain. They'd spent hours creating interlocking fields of fire between the massive helicopters. The first attack came with brutal intensity. Multiple teams rushed forward under cover of heavy suppressing fire. Bullets pinged off metal and concrete as Dalton's defenders returned fire from their prepared positions. "East side's getting hammered," Rodriguez called out. "They've got heavy weapons." The sound of automatic weapons filled the air. Through his scope, Dalton saw the attackers deploying sophisticated electronic warfare equipment. They were trying to jam communications and sensor systems. "They're pushing through Sector 2, Torres shouted. "We can't hold them." Dalton grabbed Rebecca's arm. "Get to the underground workshop. If they breach our lines, destroy everything." She nodded grimly, clutching the thermite charges they'd prepared for exactly this scenario. The battle intensified as dawn approached. Despite their training and determination, Dalton's team was slowly being pushed back. The attackers seemed to have an endless supply of ammunition and equipment. "Running low on ammo here," Martinez reported. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before we're overrun." Dalton felt desperation building. They couldn't let these helicopters fall into enemy hands, but his team was nearly surrounded. Even their fallback positions were becoming untenable. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine filled the air. Dalton looked up to see lights flickering inside the nearest Apache helicopter's cockpit. One by one, all 7 aircraft began powering up, their systems activating automatically after decades of dormancy. "What the hell?" Torres breathed. The stealth systems engaged with a deep thrumming sound. Waves of electromagnetic energy pulsed outward, creating visible distortions in the air. Around the perimeter, the attackers' equipment began failing. Their tactical radios erupted in static. Night vision devices shut down. Even their sophisticated weapons electronic systems went dark. "Their comms are down!" Martinez shouted. "Electronic warfare gear is dead!" Dalton realized his grandfather had built in one final safeguard. The stealth systems weren't just about radar invisibility. They generated powerful electromagnetic interference that could disable nearby electronic equipment. The helicopters were defending themselves. "Push them back," Dalton ordered. "They're blind and deaf. Now's our chance." His team seized the momentum. Without their electronic advantages and unable to coordinate, the attacking force began to fragment. Their military precision dissolved into confusion as the electromagnetic pulses continued disrupting their equipment. Rebecca's voice crackled through their simple analog radios, the only communication still working. "Federal response teams are 3 minutes out. Hold on!" The attackers started retreating, trying to regroup without their sophisticated gear. Dalton's team kept up steady fire, forcing them further back. In the distance, sirens wailed as multiple agencies responded to their emergency signal. "They're breaking," Torres called out. "Southern Group is pulling back." The first FBI vehicles roared into the scrapyard just as dawn broke. Tactical teams deployed rapidly, securing the perimeter and pursuing the retreating attackers. Many were captured, though some escaped in the confusion. Dalton stood among the helicopters, watching federal agents swarm the area. The aircraft's systems were still humming, creating a protective electromagnetic bubble around the facility. His grandfather's final defense had saved them when nothing else could. Rebecca appeared at his side, looking exhausted but relieved. "Your grandfather knew this might happen someday. He built in that failsafe to protect his life's work." "He thought of everything," Dalton said quietly. "Even 30 years later, he's still watching over these birds." The electromagnetic interference gradually faded as the helicopters powered down. FBI technicians began documenting everything, securing the site as a matter of national security. Dalton's team received immediate medical attention while providing preliminary statements to federal authorities. Martinez approached, looking impressed. "Those stealth systems just changed the whole game. Your grandfather was a genius." "He was more than that," Dalton replied, touching one helicopter's scarred fuselage. "He was a guardian. And now we know why he never gave up on protecting these machines." As federal agents secured the perimeter, Dalton noticed movement near the largest helicopter. Through the early morning light, he spotted Blackwell and 2 of his men slipping between the aircraft. They carried large duffel bags that made his combat instincts scream danger. "We've got hostiles by Apache 7, Dalton radioed to the FBI teams. "They're carrying something heavy." Rebecca grabbed his arm. "The fuel systems. Your grandfather's notes showed they're still partially loaded. If they detonate those, the whole technology package could be destroyed." Dalton's mind raced through the technical documents he'd studied in the underground workshop. The experimental stealth systems were integrated throughout the airframes. A big enough explosion could obliterate all evidence of the classified technology. "Cover me!" he shouted to Torres, who immediately took up a firing position. Dalton sprinted through the maze of equipment, using the routes he'd memorized during their defense. He heard Blackwell barking orders ahead, his voice tight with desperation. "Set the charges here and here. If we can't have this technology, no one will." Rounding the helicopter's tail, Dalton saw one of Blackwell's men attaching explosive devices to the fuel access panels. The other mercenary turned and opened fire, forcing Dalton behind a pile of old engine parts. "FBI, drop your weapons!" Federal agents were approaching from multiple directions, but they were too far away to stop the sabotage in time. Dalton remembered his grandfather's technical drawings. The experimental fuel system had emergency purge valves, a safety feature hidden beneath innocent-looking maintenance panels. If he could reach them? "You're too late, Pierce," Blackwell shouted. "These birds are going up in flames along with all their secrets." Using the helicopter's landing gear as cover, Dalton crawled toward the nearest access panel. Bullets sparked off metal around him as Torres and the FBI agents exchanged fire with Blackwell's men. 10 seconds to detonation, one of the mercenaries called out. Dalton's fingers found the hidden latch exactly where his grandfather's diagrams showed it would be. He yanked it hard, hearing the satisfying hiss of fuel being diverted into sealed containment tanks. "Something's wrong," the mercenary setting charges shouted. "The fuel lines are emptying." "Impossible," Blackwell snarled. Dalton was already moving to the second access point. More gunfire erupted as FBI tactical teams closed in from multiple directions. He heard Rebecca coordinating with them over the radio. directing them to safe firing positions around the sensitive equipment. 5 seconds. The second purge valve activated under Dalton's hands. He rolled clear just as the charges detonated with a sharp crack. Instead of the massive explosion Blackwell planned, there were only localized blasts that scarred, but didn't breach the helicopter's armored fuel cells. Federal agents, on the ground now. Blackwell's mercenaries dropped their weapons, surrendering to the overwhelming force surrounding them. But Blackwell himself made one last desperate move, pulling a pistol and charging toward the helicopter's cockpit. "I'll destroy the electronics. The stealth systems will be useless without their control computers." Dalton tackled him before he could reach the access ladder. They crashed onto the oil-stained concrete, the guns skittering away. Blackwell fought with the fury of a cornered animal, but Dalton's combat training proved superior. He pinned the developer face down just as FBI agents reached them. "Harrison Blackwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted sabotage of classified military equipment, and espionage against the United States," the lead agent announced, securing handcuffs around Blackwell's wrists. "You have no idea what you've done," Blackwell spat at Dalton as they pulled him up. "There are bigger players involved. This technology was worth billions on the international market." "That's why my grandfather protected it," Dalton replied calmly. "Some things aren't for sale." Rebecca joined him as they watched federal agents leading Blackwell and his conspirators away. Other teams were already documenting the attempted sabotage and securing the site. "Multiple agencies are going to want control of these helicopters," she said. "The Air Force, Army Aviation, CIA, Defense Intelligence, they'll all claim jurisdiction." "I know." Dalton touched the helicopter's scarred hull. "But my grandfather's documents prove he had official authorization to protect this technology. He just didn't tell anyone where he was hiding it." "So what happens now?" Before Dalton could answer, a group of serious-looking officials in suits approached. They carried folders stamped with classified markings and wore expressions that promised complicated days ahead. "Mr. Pierce?" The lead official extended his hand. "We need to discuss the disposition of these aircraft and their associated technologies. There are several competing interests we'll need to balance." Dalton nodded, knowing this was just the beginning of a long process. The immediate threat was over, but protecting his grandfather's legacy while navigating government bureaucracy would require different kinds of skills than those that had kept the helicopter safe from Blackwell. 3 months after Blackwell's arrest, Dalton stood in a freshly pressed suit before a panel of Pentagon officials. The contrast between this moment and his recent life living in his truck felt surreal. Rebecca sat in the gallery behind him, her encouraging smile helping steady his nerves. "Mr. Pierce," General Matthews addressed him formally, "after extensive evaluation, the Department of Defense recognizes the extraordinary value of the experimental stealth technology your grandfather preserved. The innovations in radar absorption and electromagnetic disruption are decades ahead of current systems." The general shuffled some papers, then continued. "We're prepared to offer you $140 million for the complete technical package, with the provision that you retain ownership of the physical property to establish the museum concept you proposed." Dalton's hands trembled slightly as he signed the thick stack of documents. Each signature represented another step away from his days of struggling to find his next meal or safe place to park for the night. But more importantly, they represented vindication of his grandfather's dedication and sacrifice. After the ceremony, Rebecca took his hand as they walked through the scrapyard. Their scrapyard now. Workers were already installing security fencing and renovating the main building into a proper museum space. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said softly, "not just of protecting the technology, but of what you're doing with the money." Dalton nodded, looking at the architectural plans spread across a temporary desk. The Pierce Veterans Foundation would provide housing, job training, and mental health support for homeless veterans. He knew firsthand how easy it was for proud service members to fall through society's cracks. "I spent so many years angry at him," Dalton admitted, "thinking he'd abandoned us for this pile of junk. But he was protecting something bigger than himself, bigger than family even. He just couldn't tell anyone. Rebecca squeezed his hand. And now you're helping others while honoring that sacrifice. They walked to the newly cleared Central Plaza, where 7 gleaming Apache helicopters stood in formation. Though stripped of their classified components, they remained impressive monuments to American military innovation. A stone wall behind them bore a simple inscription, dedicated to those who served in silence, sacrificing recognition for their nation's security. "We've already heard from 3 other families," Rebecca said, checking her tablet. Their loved ones worked on classified projects but could never talk about their contributions. They want to add their stories to the museum's memorial wall. Dalton smiled, remembering the lonely old man he'd thought his grandfather to be. He wasn't alone after all. There were others carrying the same burden of secret service. The museum was taking shape around them. Display cases told the carefully declassified story of Project Phantom Wing. Interactive exhibits demonstrated basic principles of stealth technology without revealing classified details. But most importantly, a growing wall of photos and stories honored the men and women who had worked on secret military projects, their contributions finally acknowledged, even if the details remained classified. A group of veterans from Dalton's old Marine unit was helping with the renovation, many of them hired through the Foundation's employment program. The sound of their good-natured banter mixed with construction noise brought life to what had once seemed a worthless junkyard. "The first Foundation housing complex breaks ground next week," Rebecca reported, sliding naturally into her role as the museum's historical director. 28 units specifically for homeless veterans, with on-site counseling and job placement services. Dalton pulled her close, still amazed at how much his life had changed since that first day he'd received the certified letter about his inheritance. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said softly. "You saw value here when everyone else just saw junk. I saw value in you when you couldn't see it in yourself." She corrected him with a gentle kiss. Together they walked through what had once been a scrapyard of forgotten treasures and was now becoming a testament to hidden sacrifice and service. The late afternoon sun caught the helicopter's polished surfaces, making them shine like beacons of hope against the sky. Where Dalton had once parked his truck in shame, a new sign stood proudly: the Colonel Marcus Pierce Center for Military Innovation and Service. Below it, smaller letters added, "Honoring those who served in silence." He was no longer the homeless veteran that locals had mocked. He was no longer the bitter grandson nursing old grudges. He had become something his grandfather had been all along: a guardian of important secrets, a protector of vital legacy, and now a helper to others who struggled as he once had. "Ready to review the next round of veteran housing applications?" Rebecca asked, already knowing his answer. "Always ready," Dalton replied, heading toward their office. He had found his purpose, his love, and his place in his family's proud tradition of service. The scrapyard that had once seemed worthless now stood as a monument to all those who sacrificed recognition for their country's security, and as a beacon of hope for veterans still searching for their way home. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.